we normally do a small little a reflection, and this week we're having it done by Vita Veach. So
thank you.
Don't forget affiliate now.
okay.
I have the reflection done, but my printer went nuts. So it's like kind of garbled. So if I start repeating myself, wait, hold on. What I wanted to talk about this morning, as I was thinking, is about ambiguity and how we have mixed feelings about things. Let me say, lately in my spiritual journey, I have been influenced by Father Richard Rohr, who directs the Center. He's a Franciscan priest, directs the Center for Action and Contemplation, CAC in Albuquerque. One of his books that so impressed me is called The Universal Christ. And he's pretty critical of the Christian church today because he thinks we have moved away from the deep spirituality of the early days after Constantine to not really following the teachings of Moses and the prophets and Jesus of Nazareth. But what Father Richard asked us to do is to try to move away from dualistic thinking. Thinking it's either or, and try to move into kind of a both either or not either or, but way of looking at things. And he asked, it's sort of complicated to me, but he asked if you can hold competing ideas in your mind at the same time. So it's like looking at not either or, but both and. And so I think that's kind of difficult, but it leaves me feeling a bit ambiguous. Father Richard has a meditation every day from CAC, and a staff of people. I think they're all called creative spirituality, but I find them very interesting. But as I was thinking about that, then I was thinking that these people, particularly those of us who do social justice work, tend to take a hard line. We know we're right and they're wrong, sort of. Well, that's not true. Just not everybody does that, but sometimes we do. But as I was thinking about that, then I read an article in the op-ed piece of the LA Times last week sometime. You may have seen it. It was written by Rich Cohen about his father, Herb Cohen, who was the great negotiator. And he got to thinking about ways we can talk to one another, even if we hold different ideas. And he describes his father, Herb Cohen. I'm going to read this because it's quite wonderful. He says, he says, the old man had the credentials that makes his thoughts on war and peace. He trained agents in the FBI and the CIA in the art of negotiation, advised Jimmy Carter on Iran, and represented the Reagan administration in the strategic talks, strategic arms talks. he even helped the NFL players on a strike and the New Orleans police strike. Whatever kind of mess it was in, they called him, and he followed. He was able to get people to agree on some things. So he popularized the win-win theory, that phrase, as he taught the game theory in Michigan in the 60s. He said that there are 4 possible outcomes of the game. You can lose, lose, win, lose. There's another one, lose, lose, win, lose, win, or win-win. And to him, that was the only thing that made really good sense in long-term solutions. So he had a few hints as you're trying to do this kind of work. He says, for one thing, you have to be patient. And I think we find that hard to do because we see some urgency in things that we want to do, but you have to be patient. He tells a funny story of years ago about taking your time, about early years, the Tsar of Russia spoke to a rabbi and said, I want you to teach my parrot to speak in Latin, and I'll give you 1 year to do it. And the rabbi's wife said, what are we going to do? You don't even know Latin. And he said, well, a year is a long time. Maybe I'll die. Maybe the Tsar will die. Maybe the parrot will die. We'll see. We'll see. So, but this thing of being patient, I think, is very difficult for us. And I was thinking about it particularly after our discussion last week on gun control. We had such a good discussion, and I was thinking about that, trying to hold 2 ideas and trying to negotiate. Some people see negotiation as a weakness. It's like they feel much more careful, much more righteous if they can just draw a line in the sand and say, my golly, this is, don't step over that line. But as we talked last week, I was thinking about gun control, and I thought to myself, I can't imagine having a gun in the house. I can't. Why would I want to do that? But what I have to understand is that there are people who feel they do need a gun for whatever reason. You may agree with them or not. Anthony, I think you said last week, it was like so many accidents happen. There's so many reasons why we shouldn't have any guns. But I think we have to acknowledge that there are some people who think they do need a gun. So we need to talk to these people. We need to help understand. And my sense is that there are people, gun owners, who are now thinking about some regulation. And I don't think they're adverse to that they will be thinking about that. So I think about that. He said, Herb Cohen said, you need to be patient. And he said, and you never humiliate the enemy. He said, they may need it, but you should not do that. And that made me think of all of us who have been in Reverend Lawson's workshops all these years. And he talks about that. It's a win-win. You cannot humiliate somebody. And he tells a story of the boycott in Nashville, Tennessee. This was early in the 50s, where Blacks could shop in the department stores, but they could not try anything on. You had to buy it, take it out. And so they decided to boycott the downtown Nashville. And it showed how, Reverend Lawson showed how the planning, strategic, and taking their time work to their advantage. And finally, the stores opened up. But he said, instead of taking out or writing an article in the paper the next day to say, victory for us, they didn't say anything. They just moved in to this new situation. And the store owners were glad to see it happen too. So I think there is a way for us to negotiate. And particularly now with the Ukraine war, we're feeling like there must be negotiations there, not more weapons, more negotiation. Anyway, that's my thought of it. It leaves me quite ambiguous, but there it is. Thank you.
I really like that, Vita. Thank you. One thing that I remember hearing from somebody is that having a discussion is almost like a holy place. And if you cannot imagine yourself having the same position at some point as the other person, and if you're taking the position of no matter what they say, you're always going to believe what you believe going into the discussion, it's not a discussion. You're being steadfast, and that really hits home because it's one of the hardest things for me to do. Yeah, I can be a very stubborn person. So we have a couple people who have joined us. So I'd like to introduce or ask Dr. Ruby to introduce herself.
Good morning. And Vita, that was really great in what you said about Reverend Lawson. And the biggest thing is for us to understand the mindset, before going into that. So thank you very much. And yes, I'm here. I've had, of course, computer issues, which I'm going to have to let go. I'd like to say assalamu alaikum. And I am a board member here. I'm here supporting different organizations. I'm a minister. I was going to say a rabbi and a priest, but just a minister. And so with Ceasefire and also with a community organization. I'm with Agape and I'm with Center for Spiritual Living. And I just love this organization because it has so many different nationalities and religions, and everybody's coming together in unity, which is what this world is about. It's peace.
Good to have you here. Barbara Pamplone, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Barbara Pamplone, and I live in the San Fernando Valley, and I've supported the UN and peace things for many, many years. And I think that you're a wonderful organization.
Thank you. Very good to have you here. Off topic really quickly. Barbara, do you know anybody with like UNESCO and stuff in New York at all?
No,
Okay.
No, I don't know anybody.
Okay.
Not anymore.
All right. I'll just put it out there. We're looking at doing some posts around some of the UN resolutions and holidays that they're doing. So if anybody out there has any contacts with social media people at UNESCO or anything like that, we'd very much be interested in finding out about that as well. So I think if we can have any affiliate reports or anything like that, that would be great. And are there any hands up? Let's see. Carol Francis.
Yes. Yeah, I really hope that ICUJP members will turn out for the People's Summit for Democracy on the 8th, 9th, and 10th at LA Trade Tech. You can find it at peoplesummit.org, and ICUJP is an endorser. So here are 3 reasons why you should go. One is to support the people of the world who are in struggle, which is what we do on Friday mornings. We just wanted to extend it for a couple more days. And to support the many organizations that are co-sponsoring this event. Secondly, to support yourself and, to support ICUJP, be there, identify yourself as ICUJP. I want to be able to tell my connections with ICUJP, we turned out 10 people or whatever. And the other is to support yourself, because you're going to learn a lot and you're going to be exhilarated just being in an environment where people from all over, not only all over LA, but people coming in from other cities, people coming in from Venezuela, Brazil, to not for this Biden's official summit of the Americas that he refused to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, or Venezuela to, but to support the People's Summit.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
Are there any other affiliate reports as well? Okay. I'm going to put a couple things in the chat here. These are the websites for ICUJP's social media. So if you have Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, by all means, bookmark those. If you see any posts, if you can give them likes, you can share them. That's great, because we're always sending out information about forums and about other events that we are doing. Also, this is the website for ICUJP.org. And, by all means, bookmark that as well, where you can have a list of all of the Friday forums that we're doing week in and week out. And on that one, there's also a button that says donate. And that's a very important button, because we have staff that is actually working to put out these emails and social media posts, working to do wrap-ups and do YouTube videos of what we're putting up on the Friday forums. So if you can help us pay for that and pay it forward on anything that you can, that is a very nice thing to do, if you can do that. Thanks for putting a link to the People's Summit as well. Salam, I don't think I need to introduce you more than what you did this morning when we first started. So it's good to have you here, and very appreciative. We're all very appreciative of having a discussion, and I'll leave the floor up to you.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, everybody. Good to see everyone again. Good to be with you. The topic that we chose was about the great white replacement theory that was conceived by a French ethno-nationalist who, interestingly enough, he started on the left. He was very liberal in his early years and voted for Mitterrand in '81, but and he was a popular novelist or a literary type. I'm not sure exactly, what genre, but he was well known in the literature world. And so his name was or is Renaud Camus, C-A-M-U-S. I don't know exactly. I don't speak French, but for those who do, you probably know how to pronounce it. Definitely better than I can. So he came up with this idea of the great white replacement theory, or the white genocide, in France. And he was basically criticizing and lashing out against the Algerian and Moroccan communities of France, that they were increasing in population, and that there was a takeover by these immigrants. And so it was a very anti-immigrant mentality that he had. And it even morphed into something called the threat of Eurabia, that Europe was changing demographically from a white population to now a multicultural, or what they would say is becoming more and more dark people of color, again, because of immigration. And so this is the beginning of where anti-Muslim animus is really a part of this conspiracy theory. And you see that, I mean, when I was in France some years back for I forgot what delegation I was with, but we were doing some fact finding about the situation in France, and there were riots there, and so when I was meeting with French Muslims, their main issue at that time, and probably to this day, is that they've been living there for generations. And it's, part of the colonial history, of course, that where European countries colonized, they brought subjects back to their countries who worked, who did the labor. So you would find, for example, Indo-Pakistanis in England. You would find North Africans in France and Italy. Italy had more, I think, Tunisians and Libyans. But in any case, you would find these ethnic populations, what they would call Muslims. They were actually ethnic groups. And so the Muslims of Europe were actually either Turkic communities or North African communities or Indo-Pakistani communities. And so that was the beginning of the ghettoization of Islam in Europe. And you would find Muslim ghettos in these parts of Europe, where a Muslim would never feel that they were equal citizens, could never integrate, and could not find jobs because of their names. So if your name happened to be Muhammad or anything close to an Arab or Turkic or Indo-Pakistani sounding name, your opportunities are diminished. So that tension just got worse and worse between the Muslim communities in Europe and their countries, their adopted countries. And so when we look at the situations in the United States, where you had the Pittsburgh shooting, Buffalo, El Paso, even here down in San Diego, in Poway, and the Escondido Mosque as well, they all are connected in that they were driven by the great white replacement theory, or that was at least invoked. A manifesto was left, and it would be invoking that. And that actually started in Norway. I forgot the guy's name, Breivik, with his terrorist attacks there, with that manifesto. And of course, the New Zealand attack of the 51 worshipers in the mosque that was actually recorded and transmitted on social media. So the idea then of the white population being replaced is really a false one. There's no replacement. If anything, if you looked at Europe, it was the Algerians and the Palestinians and the Iraqis and the Afghans who were displaced by Western intervention. and you created a refugee crisis, and they had nowhere to go, so they ended up in Europe or in the United States or in Australia. And so if anybody was replaced, it was these people who were victims of war and colonialism and invasions by Europe of some or the United States. And you know, another side note to this is that I was at a conference in the Middle East and US officials were there, and they brought in Zelensky to talk about the Ukraine. And they were, you know, the US officials were wondering why the audience didn't have a more enthusiastic response to Zelensky, because, you know, he's being invaded and we're trying to help him out. I said, well, you know, most of the people here, their countries were invaded by the same people that you're claiming to help the Ukraine. So that's why you have this this dichotomy or this paradox, and the US officials could not understand it. So it just shows that the level of acumen by these so-called, you know, the best and brightest, you know, from universities throughout the United States, the level of acumen in terms of understanding the sentiments of the Muslim peoples is still anemic. They just don't get it. And sometimes I think they don't want to get it. So that's another side note. But in any case, the point is that, you know, this conspiracy theory has a lot to deal with Muslims and Islam invading the West. And I think you're probably all familiar with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, the same theory, the same mentality. Daniel Pipes, a well-known Muslim hater, runs what's called some kind of so-called Middle East Institute, which is really a front to attack Muslims in the West. He wrote back in the 90s, you know, at the start of the Gulf War, that we should be more worried about Muslim taxi cab drivers than jihadists, because they're bringing, you know, their families, and we're having a demographic change, and our diet is changing, and halal burgers are coming, and so that's how he, you know, was mocking this migration of people who are really suffering from war overseas and have nowhere to go. And since we were involved in many of the wars, or started them for that matter, we're responsible for them, but we don't want to take the responsibility. And we get into this racist diatribe about the changing demographics of the United States. And the reality is, I think we all know that, yeah, there is a changing demographics. By 2040, I think, the white population will be less than 50%. It will still be the dominant demographic, but group, but will not have the majority any longer, because we're changing demographic. So when it comes to Islam and Muslims, though, the common tropes have not changed. Islam is the violent religion, not Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism, even though every religion has violent elements that are conducting acts of aggression, such as in Myanmar, it's the Buddhist group power that is persecuting the Burmese Muslims. In India, you're probably familiar with the state of Muslims there, and their citizenship now at risk. The Uyghurs in China, that are being called terrorists, and they have to go to cultural reformation camps, which are concentration camps. The Palestinians to this day being regarded as, you know, a land that where they've lived for centuries has been called a land without people, for a people without a land, and so on and so forth. So this denigration of Muslims has been going on for decades, if not centuries, and now is morphed into the Great White Replacement theory. So Islam is the violent religion. Islam is anti-women. Islam is trying to form what Daniel Pipes called a stealth jihad, and imposing Sharia in the West, even though nobody knows what Sharia means. Sharia actually, the definition of the Sharia is, it comes from the word shara, which means the road. And Sharia is simply, by definition, the path to God. And the Quran talks about Sharia, yeah, that we have to pray and we have to fast. That's part of the Sharia. And that we should be against stealing and against murder and against adultery. That's part of the Sharia. But it also says that there's a Jewish Sharia and there's a Christian Sharia, and there's any Sharia and any path to God, God has made it for that group. And the Quran says, to each of you, we've made a different law, a different Sharia, and a different way. If it were God's will, he would have made you into one community, but he will test you with the different revelations that he has given you. And so if you go out and want to compete with one another, compete by showing the good work that you do. And then the Quran continues to say, and he will gather you on the day of judgment and explain to you how you all differed in this approach. But the main point of the verse is that we all have a different Sharia, different path to God, and they're all recognized by Islam. And so the famous Medina Constitution of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, back in 623 AD, where he made a pact with Christians and Jews and polytheists in Medina, where he became the head of state. In that constitution, it says the Jews are a community alongside the Muslims. They have their religion, we have ours, and they have their law, and their law will be respected. And the same for Christians, and the same for the traditions of the polytheists. So that, that idea that the Sharia is now an existential threat to the West is fueling part of the Great White Replacement theory, when in fact it has nothing to do with it. And if anything, the Sharia says, I have to become a part of the society, I have to benefit the society within which I live. And the Sharia says, obviously, you cannot be a criminal, you cannot be violent, and so on and so forth. But 22 states in the United States have an anti-Sharia proposal where they want it to become law. So that also is fueling this idea of a Great White Replacement theory. And the other issue is the, as we said, in the situation in Pittsburgh and Poway, and I'm not sure anywhere else, but part of the conspiracy theory is that Jews are financing Muslims to come across our southern borders to come and kill Christians. That's part of the conspiracy theory. And so Jews become the target. And that's where you find the anti-Semitic tropes in there. And by the way, this guy who came up with the Great Replacement theory in France has disavowed all violence and anti-Semitism, but that's what's being invoked to this day. So rather than getting into a critique of this conspiracy theory and how Muslims are victims and so on and so forth, I don't like playing the victim card. In fact, I loathe it. There's no need to talk about who is suffering most in this day and age. We're all suffering. So it's not about, oh, poor Muslims, which we do about for them. There's nothing really, at this point, Muslims just want to have their own narrative. And if we can get that, that would be fine. That would be great. and control our own narrative. But what I think we should be thinking about as a group, as a society, as a government, when there was this problem of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the United States recruiting people, and there were these lone wolves, they call them lone wolves. And by the way, there's a whole double standard on terrorism. But you don't call it's rare. Like, we went to President Obama when Dylan Roof went to this Charleston church and killed Black worshipers. And we asked him, and we demanded from him, actually, call it an act of terrorism. And he would not. He would not call it. And we actually, it was a Ramadan evening, and we had an iftar in the White House, and one of our young leaders was at the table of the president, and we talked about it, and she wanted to present that to him. So she did, and he would not call it terrorism. It's rare that you find any word of terrorism around these incidents. El Paso, Poway, Pittsburgh. I think Biden did call Buffalo an act of terror. But it's rare, and it's kind of diluted. Even now the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security has considered this white supremacist violent threat as now the major national security threat to our country. And we all know, how it influenced January 6th in the insurrection. So it's a major threat, but it is not considered the same as if one person says, I give my allegiance to ISIS, and goes and shoots up something. It will be called an act of terrorism. And it will be called an act of foreign terrorism, even if the culprit was born in the United States. Even if you're a native born American, like the guy in Orlando or the guy here in San Bernardino. Actually, I'm not sure if he was native born or not, but the guy in Orlando definitely was. That was still called an act of foreign terrorism because he invoked a foreign group. Well, now if you have Norway and New Zealand and people, from France who are being invoked, it is a transnational, international, foreign problem. You can't call this domestic terrorism. The only reason you're calling it domestic terrorism is that this is now the classification for white nationalists. Whereas if you're a Muslim or a person of color, then you're going to be put under a foreign terrorist investigation. And of course, when that happens, all of your civil liberties are suspended. But if you're under the domestic terrorism statute, you still have civil liberties to protect you. So there's that double standard, and it just, again, reinforces that Muslims are the real threat. Whereas these white nationalists, you don't have that same traumatic experience than you did with Orlando or San Bernardino or any other incident for that matter. And they're all bad, is the point. Terrorism is terrorism. But there's that double standard and racialization in our policies towards terrorism. So anyway, back to my initial point. Instead of, and I agree with Steve Rohde, he had an excellent article in LA Progressive, that we can't solve this problem by controlling speech. Even if it's hate speech, you can't control hate speech, because if it's done, by the way, a lot of these laws that are passed to say we're going after these people comes back to haunt vulnerable communities like the Muslim community. And those laws are used against us. I remember back in 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing, and they passed the Omnibus Anti-Terrorism Act of 1996 under Clinton. Well, that's where the use of secret evidence is founded. It's in that law that was used against Muslims post 9/11. The use of secret evidence. So we're worried that the more laws that are passed to give more authorities and suspension of civil liberties is going to be used against Muslims in the long run. So the way we dealt with ISIS and Al-Qaeda from a theoretical standpoint, we said, as a government, that's what the government said. Strategically, we must find the culprits, investigate, incarcerate, convict them. That's number one. Number two, we must look at root causes of this. Why is ISIS and Al-Qaeda gaining an audience? Number three, we must create a counter narrative to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Well, I think the same thing should be done here. Find the culprits, lock them up, incarcerate them, convict them. In other words, those who are actually committing crimes. And that's the job of law enforcement. Number two, find out what the root causes are. And we can't say it's poverty. We can't say people are losing their jobs. Right now, there are more jobs available than ever. It's just people don't want to do those jobs. And that's why, people of color end up doing those jobs, or poor people would end up doing those jobs. But in any case, that's another discussion. But root causes is definitely an important discussion. But the most important one, in my opinion, that we should be talking about is, what is the counter narrative to the great white replacement theory? There is silence when it comes to that. And instead of controlling speech and limiting speech, we should be increasing responsible speech and demanding that from our political leaders. And that's the counter narrative. That's where the counter narrative comes in. An idea for that counter narrative then is, if they have the great replacement theory, then we should have the great enrichment theory. That this multicultural, pluralistic democracy, with all the contributions of our immigrant communities, they bring their wealth to our country. They bring hard work to our country. They bring some of the best and brightest minds to our country. That enrichment of American society, of American pluralism, of our democracy, should be the counter narrative to white nationalism. And that's what we should demand from ourselves, from our religious leaders, our local leadership. It should start locally and then influence our political leadership. Instead of just saying, oh, we don't know what to do, or we don't know what to do about gun violence. Our thoughts and prayers are for the victims, and that's it. There has to be more leadership. And that starts with a counter narrative. And we're proposing that the great enrichment theory is that counter narrative. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Back to you.
it's very, very enlightening. And thank you, Salam. I think that there's a lot of potential in talking about the great enrichment theory, because there are a lot of cultures that have either been here at the start of the migration of a lot of different groups to North America, and also some recent groups that have migrated in the last few years because of things like warfare, and it's interesting that when it comes to this replacement theory, there isn't any distinction really between the cultures that they feel threatened by. It's basically it's basically, to make it very simplistic, anybody who has, for example, a skin tone like you or I, or a last name that's hard to pronounce, or a first name that's hard to pronounce. And I think anytime you ask somebody to clarify their position, especially if it's something you find contrary, the more that you ask them to clarify, a lot of times the more that it's cloudy on their side. And whether they admit it or not, they see where the connections to reality or connections to logic fall apart. So yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot of room to have a discussion and maybe get somewhere. I really like that, and I agree with Anthony. I like the idea of the great enrichment theory. Do we, if anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand right now. I'm looking at the screen, or you can use the raised hand option in the chat. Or if anybody has any comments or anything that they'd like to say, go ahead.
I loved the reframing of language. I used a metaphor which relates to what Beta was talking about, the zero-sum game. I think a lot of people believe that there's a pie, and that if someone who has not had much of a slice of a pie gets a bigger slice, they'll get a smaller slice. So they don't want to have someone else succeed because they're afraid that they're going to lose out. But the reality is, if we work together, we'll build a bigger pie and there'll be more for everyone. And that's kind of my down home metaphor, but I love the idea of enrichment because it works on so many levels. We have so many economic benefits from having immigrants. They bring their skills, their ambitions, their knowledge, and they enrich our culture, and they benefit our economy in so many ways. There's plenty of evidence for that. But speaking personally, I have been so enriched spiritually by my relationship with Muslims over 20 years. I mean, I think I'm a little bit better Christian and Quaker because Muslims have helped me to grow spiritually. So it's just on so many levels. I appreciate the idea of the great enrichment theory.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony, and vice versa. I think we've been enriched as a Muslim community by, you know, the great work and spiritual connection with people like you. I see Chris is with us. Chris started with the religious coalition against war in the Persian Gulf. So we go back a long way. So yeah, that work together, you know, I don't want to say that it removes the line between religions, because we have our different theologies no matter what, and it's okay. That difference is okay. But not only has it made us better Muslims, but I think it's made us understand that before you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or whatever, for that matter, you have to be a human being first. You know, God created humanity and creation of this, you know, civilization before he gave us religion. So the idea of the Torah and the gospel and the Quran, the Bible, it came much later. But the idea of being a human being first, I think that's what's missing in many of our religious conversations. So these efforts like ICUJP has brought back that human element in faith and made us more God conscious, more God fearing, more God loving because of that human connection.
I agree very much. Yeah. And thank you for bringing that up, Anthony, as well. And, you know, your journey through this process as well. Stephen, I see you have your hand up. You're on mute right now.
I have unmuted.
Ah.
Okay. Good morning and hi, salam. Thank you so much.
Good to see you again.
Thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to hear you and to be inspired by your thoughts and words and wisdom. The proclivity of human beings to silo ourselves off in polarized directions where we just refuse in that polarization to be open to the enrichment of diversity and to accept a position that is different from ours or seems to be challenging to us is a part of the human being that I think we really need to overcome and to create, you say create a narrative. To me, the narrative is important. We have this narrative in the United States of e pluribus unum, out of the many one, that because we are a nation that is composed of immigrants and rich diversity, that is our strength. That is what makes America, potentially a wonderful nation. But instead, we become polarized and so critically, we see the world through this narrative of division, that the world is divided, disconnected, and dissonant, as opposed to interconnected, interdependent, and whole. And that to me, when we think of God, God is the encompassing of all people, all children of God's realm. And so we've got to get past this idea of the battling of religions and the battling of polarized political partisanship. And that seems to be the most difficult thing for people to do, to share, to share such a simple word. But that's what we have to be able to do, to share our governance, to share our cultures, to embellish and enrich ourselves through that sharing, which we seem to be loath to do in this idea of polarization and siloing ourselves off. So maybe you could speak to that aspect of it a little bit.
No, yeah, you're exactly right. I think religion came to remove tribalism. And if there's a replacement, that God wanted, he wanted tribalism to be replaced with pluralism and coexistence. And it can only be done by defending the human dignity of every human being and allowing them, each person, to choose how they want to worship God or not worship God, for that matter. But that right, that to choose for him or herself is so important. And I think we lose that in many of the, in much of the dogma that we hear from within religious circles. So that's important. Number two, I think the counter narrative cannot be complete or cannot be done even or initiated without a movement. We have to build movement around this idea. It needs organization, it needs institutional support, it needs articles, it needs forums, it needs activities and service. So we have to, start with ourselves in terms of getting out of our silos. And even with the pandemic, we have to get out of, connect through Zoom or whatever, but there has to be a movement around this counter narrative for it to have legs, and be forced, if you will, onto the political arena, and demand that our political leadership promote responsible speech. The last thing, to what Steve said, which I agree with 100%. I mean, it really resonated with me when he was talking about that. And that is that our democracy right now, everybody that, in a position of authority, CIA, FBI, DHS, the White House, Health and Human Services, you name it, whoever is in authority, they believe that our democracy now is under threat. That this polarization is the major threat. I mean, it's white nationalism is the physical threat. White national violence is the physical threat, but the polarization is the for lack of a better term, the psychological threat to our country. And unless we unite or at least build bridges, even with Republicans, by the way. Whoever from them, if it's one or two of them, are willing to listen and willing to engage, we have to bring them into the conversation. That's how we start. We cannot be ourselves isolated from, the rest of the society and demand that unless you're of this and that, political position, then we will not talk to you. This cancel culture is really, it hurts us more than it hurts, the right-wing ethno-nationalists. So we have to engage the other side and build bridges. I think it can start here. I know that in various states that, I've talked to the leadership, the religious leaders of various states. There's always one or two that they can start talking to. And we're saying, start. It's all right. Even if it's just one or two, that's a start. It has to happen. Thank you, Steve.
That's very true. Michael, I know you've had your hand up for a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate the message, especially about unity. I did want to go back to a couple of things you said at the beginning, but before I do that, I wanted to. I didn't really do this as a report, but Jasmine and Avon and I and Phil, maybe a couple of other people, I'm not sure, I think it was Carol Francis, went on Monday to the Memorial Day vigil against gun violence. And it was a tremendously powerful expression of just what you're talking about, Salam, of interfaith, intercommunity unity. I mean, there were Taiwanese Americans talking about what happened in Laguna Woods, and Muslims, and many different sort of flavors of Christianity and Judaism, and just the sense that people had there of faith and interfaith and intercommunal solidarity in the face of this kind of violence and hate. It was really, really powerful. And one of the things that was repeatedly expressed there was the idea that faith without works, I think they say, is deaf, or just the idea that it has to be expressed in action. And I think that that's vital. Kind of
I think in our faith, it goes on further to say, faith without work is disbelief. Faith without work is akin to disbelief. You can't just have faith for yourself and just praying and doing nothing with it. It has to manifest itself in work. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to share that with people who might have missed it. I want to go back to a couple of things you said at the beginning. One that struck me was that this guy Camus came out of the left. I think that's historically a weakness of the left that many. I mean, Mussolini was a socialist. That somewhere people flip somehow into this right wing, racist thing, and I think we have to, look at ourselves self-critically and to try to see where that comes from. The other thing I did want to maybe, struggle with about is the whole question of terrorism and terror, and I'm going back. I mean, this whole organization comes out of that opposition to the so-called war on terror, and I think that one of the things that was put out at that time was that somehow terror or terrorism is like how the weak fight against the powerful. And my group, the original name was People Against Racist Terror. And that has to do with the fact that the Ku Klux Klan was a terrorist organization, and that, states, state-sponsored terror and terrorism. The U.S. has been involved in what I would consider terrorist activities. So I think that we discount, when we use the term in the way it's used often in U.S. Discourse, it discounts the fact that, state violence is a form of terror. Isolation and solitary confinement are a form of torture, and those are things that the state power are using and the economic powers are using to colonize and to oppress people. And so I just wanted to add that into the discussion when we think about some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the critique about the whole counterterror culture and policies. And of course, there are many contradictions, within it. The fact is, unfortunately, as you said, Michael, that there is the so-called war on terror, which is now what, almost $1 trillion industry as part of the military-industrial complex.
Mhm.
It's a reality, and so there are some who say we need to just dismantle the whole thing, and because it's wrong, and there's some who say, well, we can't dismantle the whole thing, but we should try to reform or change the worst parts of it, but still, in a way, use jujitsu, like use its momentum to, get to where we want it to be, as opposed to just fighting it head on, which you're not able to. So being that David against Goliath and thinking about what is the way to attack this problem is key. And I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm just saying we do need to think about how to attack this behemoth that's been created, and started even before 9/11. I think you all know that. But in any case, the double standards of it, while we're dealing with that, from a policy standpoint, we also believe that the term national security, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this, has been used against so many communities, starting with the Japanese American community in the internment. It was because of national security that the Supreme Court sided with the state. And the same thing after 9/11, secret evidence, all these things were used in the name of national security. So we need a whole, in my opinion, we need a whole reflection and thinking camp on what national security means at this time. We believe at MPAC that we have to introduce another concept called human security. And it's something that FDR came up with in 1941, even though he was the one who signed the executive order for Japanese American internment. But in any case, he came up with the 4 freedoms: the freedom of expression, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. So the last two being economic freedom and removing war. Those were parts of the human security program. So we should start introducing that as a counter to national security. We should be thinking about the security of civilian populations and not just about the security of the national security, the state apparatus as our only concern about security. As long as the state security apparatus is intact, then we're supposed to be secure, even though nobody feels secure. You ask every American, do you feel secure or not? I'm sure 7, 8, or 9 out of 10 would say, no, I don't feel secure. So we're spending all this trillions of dollars on security and nobody feels safe. So yeah, the whole issue of security needs to be rethought and revamped. And again, I take your lead because that's another big project for all of us.
That's a really interesting thing to say too, because I think that we know over the last 20 years, the idea of security in the borders of this country changed dramatically when there was, after 9/11, that there's a Department of Homeland Security that is a cabinet position now that has so many different departments under it, that all of these resources were, of course it's a management decision. Those of us in business see it as something where you pull the resources where they're being used, where they need to be used, so that people know where the checks are written and who the invoices are going to go to. And it's the same sort of idea. But Yeah, that's part of I guess part of capitalism and part of how we
Yeah.
run this country. Grace, you've had your hand up for a bit.
Yes, thank you, Rick.
Mhm.
Salam, yes, what you just said actually, what Rick responded to in terms of the freedoms was what was coming to my mind is the way that our security is to secure a capitalistic, individualistic way of life. And the colonialization period was part of that and just has exacerbated the mentality of our security, as being important. And I feel that it is really ICUJP has been at the forward always of talking against the military industrial complex, because it is seminal to all the problems that we see. What I wanted to actually reflect on, Salam, was the privilege that we have had here in LA, Southern California,
Yeah.
to build a pluralistic understanding between us. And you remember the early days of ICUJP, we had a lot of disagreements. We didn't understand. There's, in terms of even beliefs, we had people with very right or very conservative views of life, and others with very open and different form of views. But we did come together, and we came together precisely on this issue of the military industrial complex and no wars and the violence and so on. And that was possible because of the kind of relationship building that took place, certainly from our leaders, at the early leaders like George and Dr. Hathout and Leonard Bierman for sure, and James Lawson, all of them building a solid relationship,
Right.
that then helped the rest of us realize we can learn to trust one another, even if you believe that LGBTQ people should not be living that lifestyle. I can believe something else, but because we trust each other, we can work together on these issues. So my question has to do, you're now national, which is fantastic. Do you see, maybe aside from New York, but do you see in the middle part of the country any type of this, this connection, and how can we begin building that? Like, can you go on the road with a rabbi and a priest and, your younger generation, we need this, like, or your sons, what do we do?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot, but let me just tell you a story about Diane. She was a Fulbright scholar who went to Turkey, and at first she had trepidation for what she thought was going to a culture that wouldn't be anti-woman. She was a woman, a single woman, and she had a dog, so she thought that Muslims don't like dogs. She heard that Muslims don't like dogs. But when she went there, it was just the opposite. They embraced her, they protected her. When the dog was sick, they asked about her dog. When the dog died, they would bring sweets to her home. Like, that's what you do when a family member passes, and you try to soothe them from this difficult time. And then when she heard about the Muslim ban by Trump, she was outraged. She called her friend at Harvard and asked who's working on improving the understanding of Muslims. And they said, well, talk to MPAC. She came to us. She told us her story. I said, you know what? She's from Athens. She was in Athens, Georgia. I actually drove over there. I felt like, I was in a scene in Deliverance as I was driving through the woods of Georgia. And so I said, you know what, Diane, why don't you tell this story to your local evangelical church? And so I found a friend who knew somebody in an evangelical church. We went there. She told the story. and it was great. And she had cancer. She passed away. She left a nice, a generous gift for MPAC to do this work. So we started a program called Mustard Seed, which is in the Bible and the Quran. It's this idea that, whatever amount of good you can do, even if it's the weight of the mustard seed, God will bring it to light somehow. So it's these small acts of compassion that can transform the world. It makes a world of difference. She was loved by her neighbors. She paid it forward in loving Muslims and telling Christians, you have it wrong about Muslims. We even had a guy from the church came up to us and he says, the tropes that you mentioned about Muslims, the anti-Muslim tropes, I use that to get Republican officials elected in the state.
Wow.
Now I realize how wrong I was. I want your forgiveness.
Wow.
So it's, these are small, but I think profound experiences that maybe God will reward us one day. If we keep working at it, it will become national. But I agree with you. You got to. So we do have a program called Mustard Seed, and I can talk more about it. It is focusing on the Midwest,
Good.
not the two coasts, as you said. So we have that program. And I have to leave in about 5 minutes. So you want to just take the next three at once, Rick, and then I can give some closing. I can answer and give some closing comments.
Sure. So Dave Clennon, Stephen Fisk, and Barbara Pamplone, if you can keep it, if you can keep your questions short, and we'll see if Salam can get through them all. Dave, if you can go first.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the presentation. I'm sorry that I came late to the forum and I missed the beginning of your talk, but I would like to hear from you, since the Great Replacement theory originated with an intellectual in France and spread throughout Europe and now the United States. I would just like to hear a few words, and pardon me if I missed anything that you said on the subject. What is the state of the Great Replacement movement in Europe? How well organized are they? What kind of electoral power do they have? And what sort of connections do they have in Europe with the United States? And in general, how we who embrace the great enrichment theory or belief, how do we relate to the highly organized and in some sense powerful movements around the globe? I think the Great Replacement theory adherents in the United States are not very well. They're powerful, they're threatening, they're frightening, but I don't know how well organized they are in comparison to groups in Europe. So any thoughts that you might have about that?
I'm really sorry. I was reading up on that, and there was some statistics where they were polling people in terms of where this stands in Europe. My sense is it's not as organized as we think it is. But like everything that is sensational, it just takes, a few words here and there, and then people get riled up and then they go act on it. And you have what happened in Buffalo, for example, or El Paso or Pittsburgh, and so on and so, or Norway. So it's more, like they were talking more about the chat lines, that are not sort of under the radar, that's where, a lot of the activity, that the chats are happening. And then when it came to the United States, as you said, it's not, I don't think it's that well organized, but you have people like Tucker Carlson, who's giving it a voice, and he would repeat a lot of the tropes from there on Fox News. You have that other television news program to the right. What's it called? It's not Cinemax, it's something Max.
Alex Jones and
Newsmax.
Newsmax.
Newsmax. So Newsmax, and yeah, and you have certain spokespeople, if you will. Now, with that, I think my opinion is we outnumber them. I mean, if you polled, are you for pluralism or not? I think there are more people in America that are for pluralism. They're good people. I think as was stated in many books, people who came to figure out what's this thing called American democracy. It was because the American people are good people. The people in the churches are good people. That's what we have to preserve, is that goodness in our religion, the goodness in our country. And we outnumber them. And I think it just takes a little organization, and then we'll find that the task is achievable. The Quran says, and I believe the Bible also talks about this, that truth and falsehood are not equal. Truth is what benefits society and remains on earth. Falsehood is like the scum on top of water, it floats away. So you have that metaphor, and you have light exposing darkness. And it's that belief in the word of God, and doing the work, and a little organizing. I think there's much hope and optimism then.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, Dave, I didn't answer your question about how organized they are. I'm just, I'm not, and I just want to put out a disclaimer. I'm not the expert on great white replacement theory, but and I'm sure some of you are more experts on it than I am. I'm sure Steve is, because he wrote a fantastic article on it. He probably has the statistics, but my sense is they're not as organized as we think.
Yeah. Barbara and Steve, if you can keep your comments short, and we're going to put them together so that Salam can answer all at once. So Barbara, if you can go first.
I was just thinking that if our government is representative of our values, our government spends, I think, almost half or maybe more than half of their budget on the military. And I throw that in as an expression. I'm concerned about the economics of the world.
Yeah. That's a very good point. And Stephen?
Yeah, just very quickly, to me, when we think of the white replacement fear, it stems from the age of colonialism and slavery, when there was a great fear among plantation owners that the slaves would rebel, take over, and that was exacerbated by the Haitian Revolution, which resulted in a colonial power, France, being outed. So that was a very clear early indication of the concern of replacement. And then secondly, I wanted to just underline the importance of FDR's four freedoms, but also what Eleanor Roosevelt was so much a part of in framing the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which as a document is one of the most profound, magnificent statements of human rights that has ever been written, and gets no publicity, no support in the political sphere of America, which is really a travesty.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I definitely agree with it. And first, to Barbara's point about the spending with the military, I agree. And again, I think we have to critique ourselves. How do we approach this problem? We have these gigantic structures, and that have been put in place for decades, and the military-industrial complex is a reality. Eisenhower warned us about it. So many people have warned us about it, but to no avail. I think one of the things, which is a crazy idea from my standpoint, is we got to engage the Pentagon. I mean, you got to find people in there that you know, while they're doing the work they're doing, they understand that the military is not going to solve these problems throughout the world. I mean, the first thing that we ever do as a country is think about the military option. It's as if there's not a military option, we can't do anything. No social intervention, no political intervention, no thinking about, you know, working with people here who know what's going on over there to come up with an alternative to war. So that requires just more engagement on our part and not giving up at this point. Sometimes I think we're much better off than we think we are. I mean, we've done more than we're giving ourselves credit for what we're doing. I think we're doing a lot. You know, as Grace said, just here in Los Angeles, the level of interfaith cooperation that's been achieved in just a short span, really, when it comes to the, you know, how long our religions have existed. But the kind of interfaith cooperation and the removing of barriers, and even on the issue of LGBTQ, the reform that we're able to develop within our communities on the rights of people and the human dignity of people, it's so important. And God says, you know, throughout Revelation, it's just go out there and say it. He tells Moses, just go and tell Pharaoh. And Moses, I'm afraid. I don't know what to do. He says, no, just I'm with you. Just remember God, remember me, go and tell him, and let the rest, let God take care of the rest. I think that's how we have to approach issues like the military industrial complex, issues like how organized, you know, white nationalism is, issues like human rights travesties. Go and speak truth to power and do the work, and we leave the rest to God.
Yeah, I think I think every great movement has started that way. So I like that. I don't want to leave this, you know, conversation with you just here and finish it up here. I think that ICUJP is in a unique position to be able to work on a great enrichment theory that is something that will warrant people paying attention to it, and journalists, and be able to create a movement around there. So thank you very much for coming. And I think that, as there's some board members on the call and other people that are involved, I really would like to have the organization take this offline and really work with you on it. And maybe there's a statement that comes out of that warrants press and really get the ball rolling.
I like that idea. I think so. I think there's momentum that we can create, and definitely ICUJP is an important platform and body for that. So we'll try to assemble everybody once we have a more crystallized version.
Yeah.
And a statement, and maybe we'll circulate it with some of you, and you can give us your feedback, and then we can all get together for launching of this important narrative.
That sounds good.
All right.
If I can just share one thing really quickly. A friend of mine, I have a lot of friends that follow football, soccer, back when I used to play about 150 pounds ago. And I was always a big fan of Liverpool. And Mohamed Salah is one of the great strikers in football, not only in the Premier League, but probably around the world. He's a great player for Egypt. And my friend was saying, about 10 years ago, if you go to a pub, all of the, there would be all these vulgar cuss words about how, ethnicity, any sort of background of
Yeah.
anybody. And he says now it's just a regular amount of cussing if he misses a goal. So
We made an improvement.
yeah. I mean, they're getting
Yeah,
better
that,
at it
you know,
in
you
England.
remind me,
So
I mean, the culture in Europe. I mean, I think even Freddie Mercury was called a Paki.
yeah, he's from Zanzibar.
He was from Zanzibar. He was, I don't know, he wasn't was he Zoroastrian? His
Yeah.
family was something, I forgot what, but Parsi, but it's rooted in Iran, and they moved to India, and then Zanzibar, and then there was a revolution, and they ended up in England. But anyway, so even people like him, as great as he was there was the derogatory terms used by his opponents. And so many people I've talked to, Muslims in England, the bullying that they had to endure growing up, the vulgarity because of their ethnicity, it's just amazing. I mean, I'm not saying that we're the greatest country in the world, all that stuff, but thank God in America, we don't have that same level of hate. I mean, it's bad, but it's not, based on my conversation with Muslims in Europe, we have no idea. We cannot fathom what they have gone through.
Mm-hmm.
At least we have opportunity here. There is opportunity, and we should embrace it and cherish it and thank God and be grateful for it and use it.
No, that's true. And
our society.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, what Impact has done, and I've posted in the chat, the website for Impact, what you guys have done in order to change the narrative in this country is monumental. And, I want to thank you for all the great work that you've done on behalf of, I know on behalf of all the people at ICUJP. So